Hello, my name is Trajan. Welcome to the first episode of the Blind Man podcast. My goal is to explain key events of our times through a wide-ranging, deep perspective analysis. You might be thinking, you lying son of a... You're just gonna shove a narrative down my throat. No, I promise you that this podcast is unlike anything else you've ever read or listened to. I will be as unbiased as humanly possible. This episode looks into the shooting of Renée Good. If there are people in the US who have never heard of Renée Good by now, their welcome back from coma cake is probably stale. Just to recap, Renée Good was a 37 years old woman, US citizen, a resident of Minneapolis. She was shot and killed by an ICE agent on the morning of January 7, 2026. We have 5 videos of the incident from both bystanders and the ICE officer who took the shots. This became a massive story, a very public tragedy captured on video. And that seems to be an important ingredient. Same city as George Floyd, by the way. Small world. It's mostly important because this has serious impact on one of President Trump's core policies, which is anti-immigration enforcement. Most of what we know comes from the cell phone footage, left of center. What people saw was an innocent woman exercising her right to peaceful protest, whose cause was noble, and who was unjustly and unnecessarily killed by ICE. Conservatives mostly describe the shooting as self-defense from a leftist agitator who tried to run over a federal agent, and he was simply doing his job. I really want to pause and marvel at the very fact that after viewing the same footage, people see completely different and incompatible realities. People just pick up their uniform, equipped with no facts, zero context. They just run to the battlefield called X to fight it all out. By the way, the title of this podcast, The Blind Man, matters here. You might think, well, it's just a dumb name. Actually, no, it's not dumb. It's cliched. So it's a reference to a story found in early Buddhism. It is about a group of blind men and an elephant, where the first blind man touches the side of the elephant and says, it's like a wall. The second touches the tail and says, oh, it's like a rope. In the story, there are more blind men molesting different parts of the elephant. You get the gist. And that's to illustrate that partial perspectives may seem perfectly valid to the observers, but they completely fail to capture the whole picture, the truth, if you like. Reactions to the killing of Renée Good are just like that. What I'm about to prove is that if you take all relevant facts into account and discard your priors, that's key. That's the hardest part, probably. There's actually a lot we can confidently understand as to what happened and the implications of it. So I will split this episode into 3 parts. Renée Good role in the incident. The question there is, was she trying to run the ICE agent over? And also, did she pose a threat to anyone? On the most fiercely contested topic of the officers shooting Renée Good, I will focus on the question, was the agent justified in his use of lethal force? Finally, I'll talk about some implications for law enforcement. The order may seem biased. I can see people objecting to focusing on the victim first, and that's not because I'm a deranged psychopath, okay? I'm not being partisan here. That's kind of the whole brand behind this podcast. I'm just trying to be chronological. The first part will inform the second part. It is, however, biased in terms of initial focus, so do keep that in mind. Quick political context. The state of Minnesota at the time was the focus of federal immigration crackdown, especially in the Twin Cities. Trump administration officials gave a number of reasons: public safety, sanctuary status of Twin Cities, some members of Somali community being naughty, committing fraud basically. Even prior to the shooting, there had been local protests. By protests, I mean people standing around where ICE agents operate, lots of heckling, blowing whistles, using social media to warn people about ICE presence, that kind of thing. So let's start with the victim, Renée Good, who was a female, 37 years old, had a wife, because she was a lesbian, had 2 ex-husbands and 3 kids. Left of center, people see Renee as a mom, poet, just good, decent, compassionate person. Right tries to frame her as a left-wing anti-ICE activist. And just to pause, does her background even matter? In some sense, no. Because just imagine, what if we were talking about a truly horrible woman who, just hypothetically, was casually slapping babies left and right, kicking puppies like footballs? We still wouldn't want her to be killed by a cop, right? That's not how we want our society to function. But in another sense, it is relevant. Critically, the video footage does not show intention, so her background matters, but only insofar as it informs whether she was capable of committing violence against an ICE agent. So that's why the public battle in the media over how Renée Good should be portrayed. The left-wing media focuses on testimony of friends and family who all describe her as very good, very decent, caring person, including her ex-husband, neighbors, and so on. Some call her a Christian. CNN, The Guardian, and others often describe her as a poet. They don't go into her activism, but kind of lean heavy on this poet claim. They would state in the headline, "Poet and mom killed by ICE." So the poet claim is a little odd to me. In the modern economy, demand for poetry is quite low. If you told me you had a friend and I knew nothing about him, and you just said, "Well, he's a poet," I would assume we were talking about some homeless bum. And that poet is just a euphemism. Now, the claim about her being a poet is not a lie. She did use it to describe herself in her, social media profile. Also, she won an undergraduate award at Old Dominion University in a 2020 poetry competition, meaning she was recognized for her poetry. But if you want to know more, for example, based on the Associated Press interview with her ex-husband, an objective description of her would be more like she was a mostly stay-at-home mom for the past couple of years with previous odd jobs like being a substitute teacher, a dental assistant, and working at a credit union, who was interested in poetry. That would make more sense. The poet term seems to me like a way of stressing that, she was a gentle soul or something. I am being a little pedantic about this. My point is, they would never do that to the officer. They would never write a headline like, "Woman killed by a bird watcher," if that was his thing. And look, the humanizing and eulogizing tone is actually problematic in terms of, understanding her background on a human level. It's very understandable. She dies and many people grieve. If you were at a funeral where, your uncle died and you were giving a eulogy, you would never mention that he was an alcoholic or that he used the N-word profusely in private conversations. But from a point of view of informing the public, eulogizing is not ideal. At the very least, newspapers should clearly say, this is not a news reporting piece, this is an obituary. But they don't do that. They just mix it into their news articles. The public should know the truth, not just a positive side of a person who died. Public discourse should be respectful. Mocking of Charlie Kirk's assassination was stupid then, and mocking Renée Good would be stupid now. We should be respectful, but we don't have to be one-sided. Right-wing media is not doing that. They will often mention those, positives because they're kind of not disputed in and of themselves, but they are happy to dig into her motives and investigate her activism. If you are a liberal, you might say, well, that's because liberals are, humane and compassionate, and conservatives are just, cold-hearted bastards. But that is false. To see that, just think of Ashley Babbitt. So she was shot and killed by Capitol Police on January 6, 2021. In her case, people also hotly disputed whether the shooting was justified. the roles of left and right wing media were completely reversed. The liberals were on the attack, framing her as, a rioter, insurrectionist, brainwashed by conspiracy theories. It was the right doing the eulogizing. And they said she was an Air Force veteran, patriot, loved American. I will concede that these are not mirror images. No two events are. One could argue they vary in terms of the victim's transgression. But the case of partisan reporting is self-evident because left and right media basically swapped places. Not to mention that when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, left-wing media had no reservations critically assessing, his controversial political views. My problem with eulogizing is that it's motivated by grief. And grief is not a good lens for understanding. We feel sorry for our relatives and friends. We don't feel sorry for our enemies. And that's just, human nature that we need to circumvent. And finally, left-leaning newspapers claim that Renée Good was apolitical, mostly based on testimony from her ex-husband. He basically said he was not aware of her political interests. Now, the right did try to frame her as a leftist activist. Kristi Noem called her domestic terrorist. Now, there's no evidence for that. It's not like she was, making bombs out of pressure cookers and setting federal buildings on fire. A generous take is that she probably meant that the incident itself makes her a domestic terrorist. But in light of the fact that Good's intentions are disputed, that's just circular. We absolutely should reject those claims. I think it is actually a big deal that a person in her position, so she's the secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, would even say that. J.D. Vance, in his address to the press, called it classic terrorism. I don't know the difference between, classical and non-classical or neoclassical terrorism. Oh, okay, but the term terrorism is just wrong on the face of it. Right of center media mostly focused on her alleged left-wing activism. Fox News said she was a member of the so-called ICE Watch. These are people who monitor and sometimes interfere with ICE operations. These claims are attributed to federal sources, though. So, so there's some doubt here. The right also leans into what happened immediately before the shooting. I will go into possible intentions in a minute, but we can see her clearly parked sideways and blocking the road. Some left-wing journalists try, clutching at straws. They will say, she was not blocking the whole street. Okay, but if I park sideways on a 6-lane highways, can I say that I'm not blocking the traffic because the other 5 lanes are free? Or they will say, she was making a U-turn. Jacob Frey, the mayor of Minneapolis, kind of insinuated that in his interview with Pod Save America as well. She was parked sideways for at least 3 minutes. We can see that in the video. I don't know about you, but when I make a U-turn, I usually don't ask my wife to step outside and heckle armed federal agents. So that stuff is just not serious. There is something to infer from the sheer fact that she parked her car in the middle of the street for at least 3 minutes. And it does make the apolitical claim dubious. If you were truly not interested in politics or activism, would the sheer sight of a police officer make you spontaneously shout, "Defund the police"? And if you follow X, let me just debunk a few things. People made attempts to undermine her character by focusing on her 2 ex-husbands. She had 3 kids, 2 from her first marriage and 1 from the second. It was her first husband who gained custody of the 2 kids from the first marriage. There's an attempt to show that she had some kind of troubled life because of this fact. But the truth is, we don't know why. Those court documents are not public. We don't know the arrangement that was made. Any claims you saw on X about the custody, they're not supported by fact checkers. There were also many alleged mugshots of Renée Good posted. Fact checkers have not found any criminal history. Many of the mugshots were proven to be of a different person or just fabricated. So that's that. Let's get to the first big question. Did Renee Good intend to run over ICE officers? It's actually confusing to figure out what ICE was actually doing at the time. Kristi Noem, who's the head of Homeland Security, said one of their vehicles got stuck in the snow. Other agents responded to help, and protesters arrived and impeded the agents from leaving. Washington Post reported that she came upon ICE while driving home from school drop-off. But that seems a little bit of a coincidence. People.com wrote her partner suggested taking a detour because of ICE activity. But they don't say where they got the exact claim from. People.com, is a bit of bit on the gossipy side. I had to do some digging. It seems that their source is a quote from a law firm representing Good's family called Romanucci and Blandin. In a press release, they described that the couple, and I quote, was driving home after dropping their child at school and saw activity by federal agents and stopped to observe with intention of supporting and helping their neighbors. So the detour is an interpretation by People.com reporters. We don't know for sure. It's just not entirely clear what they were trying to achieve. But the fact is that Renee Good was blocking the traffic and her wife was agitating officers. The only logical answer is that they were trying to interfere with ICE, maybe impede them, maybe slow them down. This matches the, ICE Watch membership claims. We have 5 videos of the incident. These videos are a little ambiguous. The angles aren't quite right. They are blurry. Some of the people recording are quite far away. Intentions of people in the footage are not obvious. On social media, there are thousands of influencers, making these outrageous claims, often in the TikTok format, where they put the video footage playing in the background and stick their giant hands in the middle of the screen, obscuring most of it, point their index finger to a blurry part of a screenshot and go, well, it's obvious that the left-wing lunatic was trying to run him over, or it's obvious that the Gestapo ICE agent executed her. But it's nonsense. If their mothers didn't drink wine during pregnancy, these people would have enough wits to take a step back, look around, and realize that the only obvious thing is that people disagree about what the videos imply. You can watch the footage yourself. It's all on X, but the best way is to rely on a frame-by-frame analysis that shows all the footage at once. This was done by New York Times, CNN, and Reuters did an analysis as well. CNN also did 3 modeling via a third party. The reporting is a little biased due to the way that it was framed, but this will be discussed later. The frame-by-frame analysis shows ICE cars on the street. As mentioned, one of them is there because they got stuck in the snow. More ICE SUVs and pickup trucks arrive later. There's a car parked sideways, a red Honda SUV. That's the car Renee Good is driving. She's honking and waving her arm at other cars. Some cars pass by her. Her wife is outside and heckling officers. Renee Good was actually quite calm and composed. She is heard saying, "That's fine, dude. I'm not mad at you." By the way, weird thing to say, kind of a sassy, defiant attitude. I'm not going to psychoanalyze this, but I would point out that she does appear calm. Her wife, her name is Rebecca Good. Now she fits the role of an agitator better. At one point she says, "That's fine, U.S. citizen, former fucking veteran." I tried, to look into this because I was curious. She doesn't strike me as a military type. Fact checkers did not confirm she was a veteran. Neither was Renee Good. Renee's late ex-husband, however, did serve in Iraq. So she might be just claiming valor by association. Again, weird thing to say. One of Rebecca's most quoted lines is, "You want to come at us? I say, go get yourself some lunch, big boy. Go ahead." And that's the clearest audio evidence we have that, they were trying to agitate the ICE officers. But that's still a strange, vague choice of words. I would have hated to be her high school teacher grading her essays, Remember, the audio is almost entirely from the ICE agent, cell phone recording. The frame-by-frame analysis shows one officer tries to open the door. The car is locked. The officer asks her to get out. He shouts, "Get out of the car, get out of the car, get out of the fucking car." She refuses. As a side note, the scene was a little chaotic. Many people, including reporters from the Daily, have suggested that a generous interpretation is that Renée Good might have been a little confused from hearing multiple conflicting commands. NPR reported that according to an eyewitness, one agent told Renée Good to drive away, but another told her to get out of the car. I'm actually sympathetic to that argument, but to be clear, there is no evidence in the footage of conflicting instructions. And then there's the main action. She reverses, and then she suddenly goes forward. Her wife shouts, "Drive, baby, drive." Her tires are skidding, because it's icy. The car rotates a little bit. Crucially, from the ICE agent footage, you can see her turning her steering wheel to the right by a lot. Then Officer Jonathan Ross shoots her 3 times. I'll discuss the details later. At the very end, probably says "fucking bitch." It's not quite certain who said that. Renée Good's car runs off and crashes into a parked car. Putting this all together, did she try to run over the ICE agent? She was of good character. She was protesting ICE presence, but her exact intentions are unclear. She was calm during the confrontation. She did not cooperate. She tried to run off. She tried turning her car away from the officer. You're free to make up your own mind. My personal opinion is that she did not try to run him over, especially because the turning of the wheel is so clear. The probability that she intended to clip him with the corner of her car are just too slim to be believable, and there is certainly no evidence to support those claims from the White House that she was a domestic terrorist. To state the obvious, it's a terrible tragedy that she died, and we all wish she was still alive. Before we move to the shooting, I also want to touch on the question, was Renée Good posing a threat to the agents or the public? Regrettably, I would say yes. Just refusing cops' orders is pretty bad. Blocking an icy road, she tried to escape in her car by doing this dangerous maneuver with ICE agents standing around. I would say that was reckless. Not trying to say she deserved to die or that it was her fault. That's a separate question. Two things can be true at once. Many liberals will claim she was exercising her right to a peaceful protest. Peaceful is a confusing word because in some sense you could say she was peaceful, if peaceful just means nonviolent. But if I drink 20 shots of vodka and then start doing donuts in the middle of a busy street with a newborn baby in the back seat, am I doing something violent? No. But I can't avoid jail by just saying I'm doing nonviolent performative art. The First Amendment does protect the right to, quote, peaceably assemble, but courts have consistently held that government can regulate time, place, and manner of protests, and states can criminalize roadway obstruction. We could debate, to what degree her actions were dangerous. Again, I'm certainly not saying punishment for that is death. And by the way, it's not enough to say, I really believe in a cause to justify a dangerous protest. Can a radical pacifist, rent a truck and block a road in front of a military base just because they are, super psyched about it? If you consider yourself a liberal, try to flip the perspective. What if this was a person from Stop the Steal? They were protesting election officials who were being escorted by some local law enforcement. Would it be okay for a MAGA person to just park between police cruisers on an icy road and then, maneuver among armed cops? If the answer is no, then we should come clean and admit that dangerous forms of protests should be condemned. We live in a liberal democracy. You can vote. You have right to free speech, to peaceful, legal protest. It's not like we are in Iran, where if you're a woman and don't want to dress like a beekeeper every day, thousands of people have to risk their lives in a violent confrontation with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Note that if Good survived this incident and managed to drive off, she would probably face state and federal charges like forcibly assaulting, resisting, or impeding a federal officer. Democrats refuse to comment on choices made by Renée Good, and I get the urge to eulogize, but the silence has consequences. In the aftermath, Tim Walz, the governor, made repeated calls for people to protest. He did say peaceful, but as I said, that's kind of not enough. He made no attempt to clarify if it's okay to use your car to impede traffic, resist federal agents, accelerate when your car is surrounded. So, he could be seen as condoning all that. We know why. Had he done that, the left would accuse him of blaming the victim. In theory, the Democrats could kind of coordinate a carefully crafted message, but that's not how politics work. Still, objectively speaking, that's irresponsible. Let's focus on the main, most consequential question: was the ICE agent justified in his use of lethal force? His name is Jonathan Ross, 43 years old, Iraq War veteran, served in Indiana National Guard. ICE deportation officer, worked in Minnesota since joining ICE in 2015. There are reports he had duties as a firearms trainer. There is one thing we know that seems particularly relevant. In June 2025, he was involved in a serious incident where he was literally dragged by a vehicle. What happened is ICE agents surrounded a car. Officer Ross broke a window and reached inside. The driver accelerated. He was dragged about 100 yards. He deployed a taser, required medical treatment like stitches. The driver of that car was later convicted, and that happened only half a year before the Renée Good incident. So that's one of those things that would stick in your head, like waving back at someone who definitely wasn't waving at you. Going back to frame-by-frame analysis, again, I'm using the work by the New York Times and CNN. Keep in mind, the New York Times one uses a political framing. They claim it's a forensic fact check, but they also frame it around a statement made by, White House Secretary Caroline Leavitt, where she said, and I quote, "Good didn't try to run him over. She did run him over." So what they will end up focusing on a lot is whether the car made contact, as an indication of running someone over. That in itself is okay because it's something objective. I framed this podcast with broader questions. My problem is the political motivation because, who cares what Caroline Leavitt, said? I mean, she's a spin doctor. We already know not to trust the White House. Yes, fine. We would prefer if politicians, waited for an investigation to conclude. But both sides are playing this game. So that was, that political framing was unnecessary. I think they could have avoided that and just stay unbiased. I already explained some of the timeline. In addition, the footage shows Officer Ross pulls up in a Chevy Tahoe at the back of Good's Honda SUV. He's filming with his cell phone. Not clear why he was using his phone. He got a lot of slack for this. The Associated Press reported that federal agencies have encouraged officers to document encounters whenever people, may try to interfere with enforcement actions. So that's the most probable explanation. That's an issue. It's clear that it's a distraction for him. He's using the cell phone, holding it in his left hand, until the very moment the car accelerates toward him. Then he drops it and draws his gun. It's just common sense. I mean, try filming something while, walking down the stairs. Well, don't try this. I don't have that kind of money to survive a lawsuit. Just use your imagination, people. As far as I know, Department of Homeland Security and ICE don't have explicit cell phone policies, but something to be said about body cameras. That would solve the problem, right? There are some issues with body cameras, mostly who controls the release of the footage. But saying that ICE should have body cameras is not controversial. Everyone seems to agree. On February the 2nd, Kristi Noem announced that all DHS officers deployed in Minneapolis, including ICE agents, would immediately be issued body-worn cameras during enforcement operations. Let's talk about him walking in front of the car. People made a big deal about that. Legal term here is officer-created jeopardy. The DHS guidelines basically say avoid walking in front of a vehicle that can be a threat. Officer Ross was dragged by a car just a year prior. You would think he would be extra alert to the threat posed by cars. We don't know why he did that. Most likely he wanted to film her face. He could have also tried to corner her into running away. If that's true, that would be wrong because she is not known murderer on the loose or something. Note that avoiding walking is not the same as saying that is illegal. You cannot be jailed for that. Policy is not the same as law. Massive confusion about this. DHS policy in itself is really just like workplace policy. You can be disciplined, even fired, but not arrested. It's like Karen from HR saying that you cannot microwave fish in the office. But if you are craving, fish for lunch, and you happen to have cod in your pocket, you can treat yourself. And when you are happily munching your microwaved cod at your desk, Karen cannot just call the police and get you arrested for it. Also, if a local cop, walked in front of my car during a traffic stop, can I just run him over? Can I do that and then point to a police policy and claim innocence? Of course, no. Getting in front of the car is absolutely a factor here. Had he not done that, the tragedy would not have happened. It was dangerous for him. I think it's fair to call it reckless. Note that if he wanted to go to the driver's side, he still had to pass either in front of or the back of the car. Strictly speaking, the issue is lingering in front of the car for so long. But if the incident was, resolved differently, Renée Good being arrested or safely driving off, Officer Ross would not be facing any charges. Again, he broke a policy, not law. Most video analyses focus on two things: the decision by Officer Ross to take the first shot, as opposed to stepping aside, and the decision to take additional 2 shots after. According to DHS policy, deadly force can only be used if an agent reasonably believes there's an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm to themselves or others. Again, policy is not law. However, this particular policy is codified in law. There is a binding federal regulation that reflects the DHS policy almost word by word. That has been upheld by the Supreme Court because it's linked to the Fourth Amendment and its language around protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. So, this word unreasonable, it just all comes from that one sentence and is then linked back to the use of lethal force. In case of shooting at a vehicle, the DHS policy also states that the lethal force can only be used when no feasible alternative to deadly force exists to prevent the harm. Media often quotes this, but this policy is not directly codified in law. So this is where it gets crazy complicated. Law is often a gray area. This definitely seems like, one of those. The idea of a feasible alternative is not there literally, but is wrapped into concept like reasonableness and necessity. The idea is that reasonable means considering the totality of the circumstances. And a feasible alternative, I guess, is part of that. I don't want to get buried in this legal rabbit hole. I just want to point out that this is one of those things that would have to be argued by armies of lawyers on both sides on the merits of the specific case. Many left of center commentators just read out this policy. Basically, shoot only if there's no feasible alternative, as if that seals, the judgment here. These people are so confused, they cannot even tell the difference between policy and law. Pragmatically, think about this. All those shootings by cops, in most cases, you could argue that instead of shooting, they could have used a taser or hid behind a wall, wait for backup. But these alternatives don't make the use of lethal force illegal. We know that because few cops ever end up in jail. In the end, do consider that argument, but don't get fooled by it. And by the way, we don't have clear information about training material that ICE uses, so we cannot comment on that. Let's go back to frame-by-frame analysis. One agent is telling Good to step out. She reverses and then shifts into drive. Officer Ross drops his cell phone, pulls his gun, and takes one shot through the windshield, and then two more shots later. Keep in mind that the events happened in split seconds. The time between Renée Good starting to accelerate and the last shot is less than 2 seconds. All those influencer, morons with their freaking index fingers, they treat the officer as if he was Neo from the Matrix, reacting in slow motion. That's just silly. Both New York Times and CNN analysis focuses on, the contact. Again, that's just how they frame it. This isn't very clear. There is only one footage that has right angle to show this. There's another good angle video, but the problem is the other officer is in the way, so we cannot see it. The main footage is grainy. It's shot from afar. It kind of looks like Officer Ross is pushed by the front left, so driver side of the car, because you can kind of see his legs sliding back on the ice as if something is pushing him back. Reuters in their analysis said contact might have occurred, but could not determine exactly, how the contact happened. Both New York Times and CNN say that the footage is inconclusive on the question. I think that's fair. It's grainy. Personally, I would not say he was definitely, hit beyond reasonable doubt. But using a lesser standard of being at least 50% sure, I would personally say that he was hit. Kristi Noem claimed he was treated at a local hospital, suffered internal bleeding, and was later released. She's of course not reliable, as we saw with the domestic terrorism comments. We don't see Officer Ross suffering visibly from an injury after, although could be the adrenaline. This is where the framing of New York Times becomes an issue. Many left-wing journalists point to this frame-by-frame analysis and say, because of the fact that contact was inconclusive, this contradicts Levitt's, White House statement. But it does not contradict it. It doesn't disprove it in a sense of probability. It's consistent with the White House statement. The big issue is the White House would ideally say, let's wait for the investigation to conclude. That's fair. But the Democrats have also jumped to conclusions. So, again, most politicians are acting poorly. Finally, in the frame-by-frame video analysis following the first shot and the probable, although disputed, contact with the officer, we see Officer Ross take another 2 shots, this time through the driver's side window. The video shows him standing to the left of the vehicle because the car is turning to the right away from him. So he's on the left side, the driver's side. That part is pretty clear. Both the New York Times and CNN confidently conclude that the last 2 shots were taken when he wasn't in the path of the car. Now, I find the many conversations about the significance of contact baffling. It's probably a big source of confusion within the public discourse. Let's test this. Imagine that I stand on a sidewalk and I see a high-speed police chase. The suspect's car hits the curb and launches into the air, kind of Fast and Furious style. I'm like a deer in the headlights, frozen with fear. I piss my pants. The car is flying toward me, but because it jumped so high, it passes just 1 inch over the top of my head. It then lands behind me and the police pursuit continues. So I'm unharmed. Some kids caught it on their cell phone, and then the whole media studies the footage. CNN does it frame by frame analysis, of me being in my pants in 3D. They conclude there was no contact, because that's true, right? Anderson Cooper comes on TV and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, it's very clear now that this loser pissed his pants for no reason. Obviously, that's absurd. I was in danger. You don't need physical contact or injury to say that. The stain was on my pants, not on my dignity." Well, maybe both. I mean, think about it. If you happen to find yourself between two gangs shooting at each other and manage to walk away with no injuries, does it mean you were not in danger? Or if you go to war, fight on the front line, and come back home, without getting wounded, were you in danger or not? Of course you were. And that's what these laws regarding the use of force talk about. Perception of danger by a reasonable person. Even if you do believe that there definitely was no contact, you cannot conclude on that basis alone that the first shot was unjustified. Anyway, I think the situation was dangerous. I kind of already explained that discussing Renée Good, that this was dangerous. The real question is, was it dangerous and threatening enough to justify the use of lethal force? There are obviously other factors that should have made the ICE officer realize that Renée Good did not mean harm. For example, the fact that Renée Good appeared calm, her turning the wheel away from him. The problem here is we don't know whether Officer Ross saw her doing it. Again, he would have been distracted by his cell phone or anything else, frankly. Something to be very clear about, the time between Renée Good beginning to accelerate and the first shot is 1 second. That's all the time he had to make the call. 1 second. People are commenting about this as if he had time to, write down a table of pros and cons, consult his wife, shake his magic 8-ball. No, all he had was 1 second. He must have relied mostly on his instincts, gained through training and practical experience. There was too little time for any reasoning. Let's look to arguments made in favor of the unjustified shooting interpretation. One of the best that I know of was made by Sam Harris. If you don't know who Sam Harris is, he is an accomplished intellectual, neuroscientist, and philosopher, famous for being one of the 4 horsemen of the new atheism, alongside Dawkins, Hitchens, and Dennett. He has a great podcast, Making Sense with Sam Harris. I would encourage everyone to listen to. Politically, I would describe him as moderate left. He described his views about the shooting on Scott Galloway's podcast from January 15th, and also his own podcast on January 21st. His description of the timeline is clearly biased against the ICE agent. I mean, he does call him a moron. Make some factually dubious claims. I don't believe he saw the frame-by-frame analysis, but that's okay, because what I care about is the logical argument, which he put very eloquently. It's a twofold argument. On the first shooting, he said, even if you think you are in danger and will be run over, what's the point of shooting? It's pointless because the car will continue moving forward. The bullet will not stop the car. And we saw that with Good's car running off and crashing into a tree. Why not just jump aside? Because there's no upside to shooting. And the second part is regarding the other 2 shots. Since you are to the side of the car, not in danger, that's corroborated by the frame-by-frame analysis, why would you shoot anyone unless you know that this person, was a crazy psychopath on a killing spree? What's the point of shooting? So he calls that an execution. Sam's arguments are helpful, but they are incomplete, and the conclusions are questionable. On the first part, is there merit in shooting a vehicle? Of course there is. Many liberals have said, if you have time to draw your weapon, you have time to evade. But what about the driver? Is the driver frozen in time, unable to react? No. If you step left, the driver can't turn left. If you go right, they can swerve right. This is assuming the driver wants to kill you, of course. From the shooter's point of view, if you value your life, the best defense might be shooting and moving to the side simultaneously, which I suspect the ICE agent was doing. Although, again, the video evidence is inconclusive. Also, if you really believe that the driver is trying to run you over, you could avoid being hit by jumping to the side. But then the driver could reverse and you wouldn't have a clear line of shot, putting you at a disadvantage. So that's why this argument is, at the very least, not entirely convincing. Regarding the second and third shots, the frame-by-frame analysis does prove that he was standing next to the vehicle, meaning was not in its path. Let me get back to my main problem with understanding all this. People completely ignore that this happened in split seconds. Everyone suffered this weird time dilation because they look at screenshots or slow motion footage. In the case of Sam Harris, you can actually tell the confusion. He describes the car as moving at 2 miles per hour and says that everything is happening very slow. He is describing it as if Renée Good was riding on a tortoise. As I said, the time between the car beginning to accelerate and the first shot is 1 second. The time between the first and last shot is 0.6 seconds. So it is reasonable to expect that within literally split second, the ICE officer would not be able to, recalibrate his tactic. Another way of putting this, should we treat the 3 shots as separate incidents, or is it a single incident where, he made one decision to neutralize the driver and took 3 shots to do that? What I find helpful is a legal framework, because the question of whether, each bullet should be treated as a separate charge or whether the subsequent shots, are part of the same shooting charge, this has been tested in criminal courts. Different legal jurisdictions interpret these questions differently. However, there is a common logic cutting through all of them, and it's about this existence of a pause or reflection, meaning that if the defendant didn't have time to reconsider their actions, there's no merit in deliberating, consecutive shots separately. Consider 2 court cases. In a New Mexico case from 1995, State versus Handa, the defendant was accused of shooting a police officer 3 times during a traffic stop. The state originally wanted to charge him with multiple charges, 1 per each shot, but the court said no, unless there's evidence of a meaningful break, like a time, space, or intervening event that shows a new volitional choice. Rapid successive shots tend to look like one continuous act. So, they kind of struck down those multiple charges, per shot. The opposite example is a California case from 1992, People versus Trotter. The defendant was involved in a freeway pursuit. He fired 3 shots back toward the police. Critically, the time between the first and second shot was 1 minute. The court said that there was time for reflection. Right? In between, he could have stopped. Instead, he resumed assaultive behavior, and each shot created a separate risk. This is quite logical. For example, if I came across a home intruder at night and lived in a state with castle laws, I could justifiably shoot at him. But what if I missed and the intruder escaped? Got into his car and I decided to pursue him for hours, like across state lines, and then eventually he runs out of gas, and I just go to him, say, "Hasta la vista, baby," and shoot him point blank between the eyes. Obviously, the second shot was murder, even though the first shot was legal self-defense. But now imagine the opposite, okay? I sit on a bench in a public park, somebody rushes at me with a knife, I draw my concealed weapon and fire 2 shots within 1 second from each other, so kind of like a double tap. And imagine that the first shot hit him in the shoulder, and the impact was that the attacker stopped and dropped his knife. The second shot hits his head and kills him. Now a prosecutor meets me and says, "Well, we know the guy had a knife, so, it was fair game. It was self-defense. We won't be pressing charges." And I'm like, oh, thank God. I was worried I would go to prison. I'm too good looking for that. But then he says, "But we are also aware of another incident where you shot an unarmed man who had a shoulder injury and required medical attention, and you just killed him in cold blood. We'll be asking the judge for the electric chair, you sick bastard." So that would be crazy too, right? Which approach applies in Renée Good shooting? Everything is up for debate. My opinion is that because the time between the first and the last shot is 0.6 seconds, I don't think you can make a viable case that he had time for pause or reflection, I suspect is the strange time dilation effect that explains why people are confused about this. If you compare static screenshots, you might imagine that the ICE officer, walked away from the front of the car where he took one shot and just casually strolled around the car and just thought to himself, why don't I put some more bullets in this poor woman just for good measure? That's not what happened. This took literally a fraction of a second. And the reason that he found himself next to the car where he takes the other two shots is not purely because of his own movement, but to a large degree because the car accelerates and moves relative to his position. And again, if you still believe that the second and third shots were an execution, you would have to convince yourself that Officer Ross had enough time to pause or reflect. My take is that's too far-fetched, and hence, ultimately what matters is the decision to open fire in the first place, not deliberation on every single shot, purely based on his position relative to the car. Note that the key question, was the agent justified in his use of lethal force, will probably never be resolved in court. The state of Minnesota might be interested in charging Officer Ross because of public outcry and politics, I guess, but they probably wouldn't be able to do it. Firstly, there's a federal officer removal statute, which means the case would probably be moved to a federal court. Also, there is a supremacy clause immunity. Federal officers may be immune from state criminal prosecution for acts within federal duties if the officer reasonably believed the action was necessary to perform those duties. Trump administration has already expressed full support for Officer Ross, and so federal case is also very unlikely. Now that we have covered so much, you can draw your own conclusions. Obviously, we would all prefer if he didn't draw his gun. In this case, other agents could have acted differently, maybe just had instincts to dodge rather than shoot. They could have taken into account the fact that Renée Good was calm. They might have noticed she was turning away. But it is possible that Officer Ross did not notice those cues. Remember, we are not asking whether he chose the most optimal path of action, had he had all the time in the world. I mean, we already know that the answer to that is no. The question ultimately is, could a reasonable person believe there was an imminent threat of death or bodily harm and decide that shooting was the best option? My own thinking is he had 1 second to make a call. The successive shots should be treated as part of the same intention, mainly because they all happened within 0.6 seconds. Based on what I discussed, I would say the perception of a threat was reasonable. He might have reasonably suspected that the driver wanted to run him over. There was too little time to calculate the effectiveness of just jumping to the side, especially that if he really believed she wanted to run him over, he would have also believed she would pursue him further. My own opinion is that in this case, he was justified in the use of deadly force, even though, with the benefit of hindsight, there is no doubt this was a tragic mistake. And don't be confused by the term justified. I'm not saying it was just to kill her or that this was justice served. I simply mean it was objectively reasonable to use lethal force given all the circumstances. That was my main question, which I used to frame the whole discussion. But a related question that's actually much more consequential is, should we as a society expect officers to evade vehicles instead of shooting at them? I imagine most people would say yes. In the case of Renée Good shooting, you can easily see how this is not about a piece of paper with a policy on it. It's about training, right? Because the officer had only 1 second to figure out what to do. That choice has to be instinctive. So then the question really becomes, should we train officers to always evade if they think a vehicle is trying to run them over? We cannot really answer without studying a large number of these incidents. I mean, that's why I didn't pose this as my main question. I honestly don't know the answer. And if you think the answer is yes, let's train the officers to always jump to the side, let me push back a little bit with an extreme example. What if you were a cop responding to a terrorist attack where an Al-Qaeda fanatic is using a car to mow down people during a parade? If you're a European, you just, call that Monday. So you're the cop, the car is moving at you. Should you also just evade without taking a shot to try and stop him? My point is that I don't think you can escape that core legal concept of what would a reasonable person believe or do. I don't think you can write it in stone like that. Still, a public debate on this would be helpful. Just as a side note, we could also just disarm agents. That's what they do in the UK. 96% of British police officers do not carry firearms. Only specially trained units do. But clearly, that would never work in the US. If you're from Texas, you're probably firing into the ceiling right now. Besides, you would still have to deal with incidents related to those special units that do carry firearms. So the moral, philosophical question would not go away. We already covered some other law enforcement topics. The ICE agent was using his cell phone and might have been distracted. We already agreed on that. I mean, there's a consensus that they should be wearing body cameras, with the caveat that the release of footage has to be governed by someone. Walking in front of the vehicle, that's an important takeaway. That policy of avoiding getting in front of vehicles, it's already on paper, but it should be drilled into all who join the force. Jonathan Ross was dragged by a car before, and he was still like, yeah, this is a good spot to stand. I have seen many people say, including top Democratic leaders, the killing of Renée Good shows that the anti-immigration crackdown is a threat to the public and should be stopped. I'm going to come out strong and say that the argument is wrong. It's a false choice. This shooting wouldn't have happened without a dangerous form of protest. To see that just put the shoe on the other foot. What if pro-life activists started using vehicles to block traffic, to agitate officers protecting abortion clinics, and then run off when officers try to arrest them? That would eventually lead to tragedies. The activist might get shot, or an officer might get run over. Now imagine a pro-life activist comes out and says, innocent people are dying because of this. We must shut down these abortion clinics. Again, that's a false choice, because any policy, no matter how sound, could be derailed by activists, willing to fight for it. Other people were furious about this bystander that offered medical help and said he was a physician, but ICE agent refused. So that's actually pretty common for law enforcement to tell unknown bystanders, even ones claiming medical training, to stand back. Because in serious incidents, they want the scene to be controlled. There's nothing nefarious about that. In this case, firefighters arrived around 6 minutes after Renee was shot, so that wasn't a slow response. The FBI has been reported to be investigating the deadly use of force. State and local officials have publicly complained they were blocked from accessing the evidence. I don't know the exact machinations between, state versus the feds, but obviously this is a federal agent enforcing federal law. I personally would love to see an investigation. It could clarify many of the issues we discussed. In the UK, police must refer the most serious incidents, like shootings, to the Independent Office for Police Conduct. And then these guys decide whether to launch an investigation. So it's not up to the agency that employs the officer involved. That's a reasonable practice. We could maybe borrow that. The vinegar and French fries, they can keep that. But independent commission, it sounds good. There are many other law enforcement-related questions, but I don't think they can be answered using this case alone. One is, should local law enforcement cooperate with ICE? That's a favorite point repeatedly made by Tom Homan, the White House border czar. He's basically saying if it wasn't for sanctuary cities like Minneapolis, ICE would be able to work with prisons to deport illegal immigrants who commit crimes, as was the case under the Obama administration. But Renée Good incident doesn't speak to that question. Some said that police should have been there to disperse the protesters, but this wasn't a planned operation. The ICE car just got stuck in the snow. So I don't think this tells us about the role of local police. Another massive question is, do we want to have mass deportations and anti-immigration crackdowns in the first place? But again, this incident is not a good basis for attempting to answer this. There aren't even immigrants in this picture, as far as I know. The ICE vehicle was just stuck in the snow. They weren't trying to deport Renée Good because she was an American citizen. I would love to discuss this in another episode, maybe. Same is true for any debate regarding those, heavy-handed tactics used by ICE, like, breaking car windows, entering, house without warrants doing Normandy-style invasion of Home Depots? For those questions, we would have to look at the whole picture, not just one case. Well, that's all. I hope you enjoyed this. If you think that you learned something important, please subscribe. If you believe that a podcast like this could solve some of the confusion you see in the world out there, please share it. And thanks for listening. Any mistakes in this podcast are my own. Take care and goodbye.